Living without compromise. We should never compromise God's truth in order to avoid rejection and persecution. Here's Gene.
When we think about this principle, Jeremiah is a stellar example. A man who would not compromise. And when you talk about rejection and you talk about persecution, he faced it. But he never compromised. In fact, as a result, he went to prison. And here we have the first imprisonment. Chapter 37, verse 15 and 16. The officials were angry at Jeremiah and beat him and placed him in jail in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for it had been made into a prison. So Jeremiah went into a cell in the dungeon and stayed there many days. Now, the reason he went into prison was that he was accused by the officials, the high officials under the king, that he had betrayed them, or he was disloyal, or he was going to join the enemy. And they called him a liar. And consequently, they threw him into prison. And one of the reasons they threw him into prison was they didn't like what he was saying about the judgment to come. In other words, they rejected his message of judgment that God brought to Judah, but also they accused him of betrayal, of lying, joining the enemy, desertion. He paid a real price for that. Now we have what I call a truthful response, and this is interesting because this involves King Zedekiah. Now Jeremiah takes us once again to the last king of Judah, Zedekiah. King Zedekiah later sent for him and received him. Now let me simply say that Zedekiah didn't know everything that was going on among the officials. He perhaps heard by the grapevine that they had put him in prison, that is Jeremiah. But you will see that Zedekiah had mixed feelings about Jeremiah, because Jeremiah was speaking words that he said came from God. But at the same time, Zedekiah, like the other kings, were very, very disobedient. But in a moment of concern and anxiety, perhaps, King Zedekiah later sent for him and received him. And in his house, privately asked him, "Is there a word from the Lord?" Now that's very significant because he didn't want the officials around him to know that he was consulting Jeremiah. He was really walking on a fence and trying to protect himself because he knew he'd be judged severely by the officials who really rejected Jeremiah. But he called him in and said, "You have a word from the Lord." Now that speaks volumes about Zedekiah, where he is spiritually. But notice Jeremiah's truthful response. "There is." Jeremiah responded, and he continued, "You will be handed over to the king of Babel." In other words, he came from prison, brought by the king, asked for a word. How easy it would have been to compromise. But he didn't. He said, "Judgment is coming." Now, the fact is that if you look at the context, he also said, "Please don't put me back in prison because I told you the truth." And Zedekiah listened, and he put him in the courtyard rather than he was really confined, but he wasn't back in this prison cell. But there's more coming. And I've called this Jeremiah's second imprisonment. And this is worse. This is terrible. So they took Jeremiah and dropped him into the cistern of Malchiah, the king's son, which was in the guard's courtyard, lowering Jeremiah with ropes. There was no water in the cistern, only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. By the way, they believe they found this pit, and there's still mud after all these years. They lowered him into this pit. Josephus, by the way, says he was up to his neck, but I think there's evidence that later he was able at least to move his arms when they got him out of the pit. But can you imagine? I mean, the persecution, the price that this man paid for telling the truth. And the whole context of this is that these leaders, they were angry, they were threatened by him. And by the way, I think there's evidence that Zedekiah found out later what they had done in terms of putting him in the pit. And there was a man that is mentioned that it's interesting. His name is Ebed-Melech, who came to the king and said, evil people have done this. He said this to the king, and then the king got him out of the pit. And if you study this guy, he came from Africa. He was a Gentile. He was probably a eunuch. He was a servant of the king, but he was a righteous man. And later you will find out that because he stood up for Jeremiah, he did not suffer the consequences of the judgment that came on Jerusalem. But that's the background. And so we read here in Jeremiah 38, Jeremiah therefore said to Zedekiah, this is what the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel says. If indeed you surrender to the officials of the king of Babylon, then you will live. This city will not be burned down. In other words, Zedekiah got him out of the pit, brought him in, and this was the message. This is, in a sense, an expanded message. Here is the way, Zedekiah, to survive. Being killed. Surrender. Submit. And so we read that your household will survive. But if you do not surrender to the officials of the king of Babylon, then this city will be handed over to the Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians. They will burn it down, and you yourself will not escape from them. Sadly, he didn't listen. The king didn't listen. And we're going to read in a future principle where he was actually then blinded and led in chains all the way to Babylon. And as I thought about the incredible commitment, refusal to compromise, I thought of the apostles. We have an interesting illustration in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 5, someone came and reported to them, look, the men you put in jail are standing in the temple complex and teaching the people. And there it refers to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a group of 70 men who were responsible to rule over Judaism. And so the report came that the apostles are standing and preaching and teaching. Then the commander went with the temple police, and the temple police was a group of individuals appointed by the Sanhedrin that was actually a part of the Jewish operation there in Jerusalem. Then the commander went with the temple police, brought them in without force because they were afraid the people might stone them. In other words, a lot of people were following and listening. Tension existed. So they brought them in peacefully. After they brought them in, they had them stand before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest asked, didn't we strictly order you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to bring this man's blood on us. But Peter and the apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men. That's Jeremiah in the Old Testament. Here we see it illustrated in the New Testament on the part of the men that Jesus Christ has chosen to bring the gospel to the whole world. We must obey God rather than men. Now this raises a very significant question for application. It's a bit complex when you think about this principle that we've just looked at. How do we reconcile obeying God with submitting to government authorities when there's a conflict between these two biblical principles? Well, let me try to give you an illustration of the context in relationship to Jeremiah, but also in relationship to the apostles. In relationship to Jeremiah, it involved the Jewish community, a self-contained community. In the case of the apostles, it also involved, in a sense, a self-contained community within Jerusalem and Judea, because Rome had given authority to the Sanhedrin to maintain order and to execute order and to implement order in Jerusalem. So the Roman emperor wisely, in a sense, gave the Jews authority to control themselves in Judea. Now, why that's important is that when the apostles stood up to the Sanhedrin, they were not rebelling against the Roman government. They were rebelling against the religious leaders in Judaism when they said, we must obey God rather than men. Let me try to give you a simple illustration. I was a part of a religious community. And eventually I was excommunicated from this community, though I still have many, many friends and I have a deep love for these people. But I was excommunicated from this community. One major reason was that I had studied at Moody Bible Institute and I was teaching at Moody Bible Institute. And I was called before the whole congregation in that local community. And in a sense, I had an opportunity to recant and say, I'm going to resign my position so I can stay a part of this religious community. In essence, I had to say, I can't do that because I've got to obey God rather than man, because I felt that this theological system really was an error in relationship to what I was doing at Moody Bible Institute in my teaching. Now, that's totally different than taking a stand against the government. I was within a religious community. That's a simple illustration that illustrates the problem, the challenge the apostles faced, and why they said we must obey God rather than man. Now, there's the larger community, and that's the Roman Empire at that time. And that's where Paul came along and said that recognize this government, pagan though it is, as a servant, and submit as much as possible to that government to be at peace. And that's a very important distinction. But even then, there's a line we cannot cross. And that's true within the Judaism at the time when Rome was in power. Even true in Babylonia, when they were taken into captivity, and men like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego refused to bow down and worship. See, it's one thing to submit to the government. It's another thing to submit to the government and reject God. And at that point, there's a line we cannot cross. Now, the interesting thing is we live in a very, very unique moment of history in a culture where we have freedom of religion, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom to voice our opinions. And one of the things that as Christians we need to do is to be sure that we use the process that we have to voice our opinions. And it's a shameful thing that a lot of Christians will complain, but they will not vote. And I believe that's inexcusable. We have a unique moment in our history, and we need to take advantage of that freedom that God has given us.